And the Vietnamese said, I was 16 years old. I didn't know anything about democracy, communism. I just saw the Americans shoot my sister to death. That's all I had to know.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us with this very special recurring episode with Mr. James Bradley. I've read your book since when I was learning English in like middle school. And I'm so excited that you actually can be a recurring guest on our Pacific Front Untold YouTube channel and our podcast. So, and actually last weekend, I was telling this lady during our community movie night that you're going to be a recurring guest, and she was like, he's a maverick. How exciting. So she's going to subscribe to our channel now. And then she was telling me like, oh, he lives in Wisconsin and whatnot. And I said, I don't think he lives in Wisconsin anymore. Anyway, I read all your books, but I don't really know too much about you. So let's go. Who are you?
Well, I'm James Bradley. People know me as the guy who wrote Flags of Our Fathers. They know my father as the guy on the world's tallest bronze monument, the Iwo Jima Monument in Washington. Clint Eastwood and Steven Spielberg made the movie Flags of Our Fathers. And then some people like you know me for the 5 books I've written: Flags of Our Fathers, Flyboys, The Imperial Cruise, The China Mirage, and this latest book, which just came out last week, called Precious Freedom, about the Vietnam War. But let's go back to the beginning, and I'll tell you some things about myself that never come up in interviews and I don't tell. So I'm James Bradley. I was born in 1954 in northern Wisconsin. No, God's country. And looking back, now I'm 71. I can look back, and I was in like a Norman Rockwell kind of life. I had 7 brothers and sisters. I never saw my parents argue. My dad came back from World War II as a hero. He married Betty. They had been school sweethearts in the 3rd grade. They went to school together, church together. They knew each other. They were from Appleton, Wisconsin. So these 2 sweethearts married. I never saw them argue or even a cross word. And then my dad, it was the 1950s. My dad had one ambition in life, business-wise, and that was to be a funeral director. And he started the Bradley Funeral Home. It was the largest purchase in the county when he bought that funeral home at 33. He went to the first bank, asked for a loan. They said no. He went to the second bank. They said no. There were only 3 banks in town. So he went to the 3rd bank and he said, I'd like a loan. And if you don't give me a loan, by tomorrow morning, I'm going to go to the other 2 banks. So they had a meeting that night and they gave him a loan. My dad, growing up with him, we didn't think he was a hero or such a successful guy. You don't think that about your father. But looking back, I had this tremendous example of a guy, if you're one of the guys who beat the Japanese at Iwo Jima, I mean, to give you an idea, they sent the armada of ships. It was 80 miles long. They sent it for 40 days. It went over the curvature of the earth. They hit Iwo Jima 90 seconds after the deadline. They were 90 seconds late with 100,000 guys. So that was how my dad was trained. And that's how he trained his kids. Not as a tough guy, but when my dad came down for breakfast, he was dressed in a tie and a shirt. And when he went outside, he was in a suit and he looked good, looked sharp, and shoes shined. And he was
And
just
he
a
was
great
humble.
example. What?
He was humble. I remember reading that he said that the guys who are the real heroes are the guys who never came back.
The point of Flags of Our Fathers is that my father never talked about Iwo Jima. He had all these phrases. Hey, Dad, what about that flag raising photo? And he said, yeah, if only there hadn't been a flag on that pole. Say, Betty, can you pass the butter, please? An insurance salesman came to a meeting of my father in a investment group in our hometown. And he came up and, I understand you're John Bradley of Iwo Jima. And my dad looked at him and said, yes, that was a long time ago. You just didn't talk about it. So we didn't know. And my dad dies. And then I go on, but that's getting ahead of the story.
Right.
So
And
my
he would
mother,
tell you He would tell you to like say that he went on a fishing trip when the press called, right? When you were a kid.
In the book and movie, you can see in the movie, they had 3 actors portray me. You know, I'm so handsome, they needed 3 actors. But at one, they had an actor at 13, and the Bradley family is eating at a table, and the phone rings, and little Jimmy gets up. I'm 13, and I pick up the big phone. It's as big as my head, and it's Walter Cronkite's producers calling from CBS in New York. And I say, "No, my dad's not here." He was right over there. And I was trained to say this. I didn't know why. I was a little 13-year-old dumb kid, you know. "No, he's ice fishing in Canada." "No, no, no, he doesn't have a phone. He's living in an ice shack." "No, we don't know when he's coming back. He just fishes up there." "Yes, sir. Okay, thank you." "No, we don't know." "Okay, thank you." You know, click, and I'd go back and eat. And we wouldn't discuss it. So my dad had trained us how to avoid the press. And he avoided the press, wouldn't talk about it. Then he gets in the grave. Let me tell that story in a couple minutes. I want to get to something. So my mother was a reader. So I'm a little dumb kid drying the dishes. My mother's washing the dishes. And she starts talking about the Tsar of Russia and the Tsaress. And I'm a little kid, like looking outside at the snow, like, where are the Tsar and Tsaress of Russia? And then I go in the sunroom and I find a book on Russian nobility that my mother's reading. You know, I realize, wow, there's pictures in this book. She's getting this, she reads books. So this is like I'm probably 7 or 8, you know, just
Yes.
discovering that there's a world in books. So my mother had this sunroom with comfortable chairs and kept her books and magazines in there. So I started going in there and I realized that started my reading habit. So I want to say to all parents, your children will imitate you. And there's a study from it's called K to 7, from kindergarten till the kid's 7 years old. Their frontal cortexes are not developed and they're just absorbing everyone around them. So if you're drinking beer and swearing at your husband or wife and sitting on the couch and, you know, beating each other up and watching TV all day, that kid, that's what that kid is going to do later in life. And if you're like my parents or my dad's outside working, well, we went outside and played. Or like my mom inside reading and, you know, taking care of the house. Well, I started the habit of reading. I realized not because of me, but because of my mother. I'm 13 years old at some point, and I'm in the sunroom and I pick up the Reader's Digest, and there's an article by James Michener. Now, people, I'm shocked, don't know who James Michener is today. But James Michener was by far the biggest selling author of my youth. When James Michener came out with a book, it was national news. And he came out with many books. They've been made into movies. James Michener is one of the biggest selling authors in history. And James Michener goes throughout my life here. So that's James Michener. Well, James Michener writes an article in the Reader's Digest. I'm 13. And it was an article addressed to kids who wanted to go to college. And he said, when you graduate from college at the age of 22, people will ask you, what do you want to do with your life? He said, it's a great question. Answer it when you're 35. He
Can
said,
we go back and ask the question though, since we're 13 now? But I actually had this question while I was reading your book. How did your family go on road trip with like 8 of you, I think? 8 of you, did you guys have a minivan or a small school bus?
no minivans then. We had 2 station wagons and we didn't go on road trips. We had a cottage at Bass
Mm.
Lake. So the cottage was better than Disney World and everything put together, you know? So during the school year, we lived in our home and
Where's your home? Where was
Antigo,
your home?
Wisconsin. And, you know, this was the 50s. We had a big yard, football, baseball. I mean, my mother had trouble getting us in the house. We were outside having so much fun with the neighbor kids, catch one, catch all at night. You know, it was really a fantastic childhood. And then in the summer, we were up at Bass Lake, you know, motorboat, skiing, you know. I just lived in that lake when we were up at the lake. So, you know, that's the way they did it. So we had a cottage and a home. And then my dad had the funeral home. So a lot of snow shoveling. So I'm 13 And I read this article, and Michener says, when you're 22, people will pin you down. What do you want to do? And he said, answer the question when you're 35. Give yourself leeway to just fool around, do what you want. And then he used examples. He said, I went to Afghanistan as a teacher, broke as a teacher. He said, I would not have been able to write my book Caravans if I hadn't done that. He says, I was broke in Spain, bumming around hitchhiking. And he said, later would not have been able to write my book, The Drifters, if I hadn't done that. So he came up with examples that you need life experience. And we're seeing that now, that the kids who just, go to college, 22, decide what you're going to be, take it easy. You could take 5-10 years. See, the parents want you to, what are you going to do? Oh, you have a job at the bank? Okay, honey, that's great. Mimi's got a job at the bank and, she's secure. Your parents want you to be safe. So anyway, at 13, I was like, in kind of a soft admiration of James Michener. Now, it's important to realize I didn't think I was going to be an author. Authors were people who were in books, and I never imagined being an author for many, many, many years. James Michener traveled all over Asia. His books came from Japan and islands and Korea, and so Asia opened up in my mind. And then I got the idea that this guy moved around and he had these adventures. So at 13, I thought, I'm going to have an adventure. So I hitchhiked at 13 from Antigo, Wisconsin to Bass Lake. Well, that was like a 20-minute ride.
Yes.
And the lady that picked me up, an old lady behind the car, she pulls over. I'm thinking, I got a ride. And I open the door and she says, are you Johnny's boy? I looked like my dad. But I was 13 and I got up to the cottage all alone without my parents. Jenny, I thought I had gone to the moon. I thought I was an astronaut. I was Rocky and John Wayne and everything put together. I mean, I had traveled, and that ignited a bug. I didn't realize later, a Chinese woman told me that I'm a horse, an astrological horse. And she said,
me
horses.
too.
Okay, well, horses like to move around, so you travel.
Yes.
So that ignited. So then I started having maps of my county on my wall in my bedroom, and I started biking those roads. And then it got into the state. I thought, well, the state. So I started moving around, and then eventually I hitchhiked across the United States 4 times. And that was back when a guy could hitchhike and not get shot to death. So, okay, so that's my...
How old were you when you hitchhiked?
I was between 18 and 22 when
So
I
did you go to
hitchhiked.
school? Were you in college when you hitchhiked?
Okay, let me get to that. So I wanted to be a football player. Here, let me go back to... Now, my next book is called Be an Author, and what it's about is not how to write a book. The title is Be an Author and then write a book. In other words, all the books on how to be an author are about writing. And I've discovered that's not the key, because I know thousands of people who have come to me with their writing and they didn't become an author. So the key is not in the writing. The key is psychologically just imagining yourself as an author. So I imagined myself as an adventurer at the age of 13. Asia, I didn't know where Asia was, but James Michener came from Asia. And that's who I have become. I'm a guy who spent 30 years roaming around Asia writing books. And it's because of that germ, that seed, when I was 13. And that's the idea I want to get across in my next book, that you become what you think and feel about. If you have an imagination about what you want to be and it's covered with feeling, this is how we lead our lives. The reason you can get to work in the morning is because you don't realize it, but as you're projecting an image of yourself driving to work. That's why you can drive a car without thinking about it and get to work and check in and open the door and do all this stuff. So we have this autonomic nervous system that's working for us, and it can be programmed, not just by, I want to be rich, but truly, if you have a desire that you wrap with thought and feeling, you will become that. And my life is an example of that. And the seed was this James Michener Asia thing, and this will pop up later. But I want to be a football player because Antigua was the number one football team in the state, and football players got all the press, and the cheerleaders had nice legs, and I wanted to play football. I broke my neck playing football. Long story. I was in the Mayo Clinic, paralyzed. I should have spent my life like Christopher Reeve, Superman, in a wheelchair, with a tube in my throat. But I just didn't break it enough. But I couldn't play football. But I had, I was going to go to Notre Dame to play football. So I was on that glide path. I went to the University of Notre Dame. I became president of my freshman class. And I was kind of unhappy, like Notre Dame, bunch of rich kids from Chicago here, and somehow I just wanted more adventure. And a guy named Matt comes up to me from California, says, "Hey, you should go to school in Tokyo. There's a program in Tokyo." At that point, if you had asked me like to put Tokyo on a map, I would have looked in China. And people don't believe this, but this is 1973. And
Yeah.
Japan, China, Beijing, Tokyo, people didn't say words like that. You could live years with nobody without hearing the word Japan. There was no China. China was just a dark thing with a guy Mao. We couldn't see in there. They couldn't get cameras in. And when
Right.
he said Japan, I knew it was Asia, but if people don't believe me, let me challenge you. I'm right now doing this interview from the island of Mauritius. Do you know where Mauritius is? Do you know the next island, north, south, east, west of me? Like, could you draw it on a map, all these islands around me? How far am I from the coast of Africa? Do you know that? No, there's parts of the world you don't know. And I
Right.
didn't know back then. I was from Wisconsin. I knew
Hmm.
Chicago and Milwaukee and, I want Miami. I didn't know. So anyway, I signed up for the program, and it wasn't until I got to Tokyo and I'm in Tokyo Station from the airport and I'm looking at a map and I realize I'm on an archipelago. I'm on an island. I'm not on the mainland. That's a true story. I was 19 and I didn't know Japan was a bunch of islands till I was in Tokyo Station. So anyway, we're going to school in Japan. And in 1973-74, you were a celebrity if you were a foreigner in Japan. Little kids, would on their mother's shoulders would see us on the subway, and they just had never seen a foreigner. And little kids would come up to us and ask us for our autographs, because there weren't many foreigners. So
How
of
did you
course,
feel the first time like someone asked you for an autograph?
well, they're just, they're kids and we were foreigners, and it was Tokyo. It was just unique. It wasn't like I went, Los Angeles, all over the world and people asking me, but you know, this was just, we were unique. I'm just trying to say now you can go to Tokyo, it's full of tourists. Well,
Hmm.
my Tokyo was not full of tourists. When I showed up somewhere, I was the only foreigner that they had seen for a while. So anyway, we're in Japan having fun. When Tina Turner came for a concert, we went dancing with Tina Turner. When Elton John came to a concert, there were so few foreigners that, we'd be in the disco with Elton John, and all these stars. So we're in Japan, and this is the thing. I'm the only guy who hitchhiked all over Japan of our whole program. And I'm the only guy that not only had a close girlfriend, but I had a close boyfriend. I didn't realize it then, but I was the only American in the program who really made close contacts with the Japanese as people. Now, my father had fought the Japanese. The Japanese tortured his best friend to death right here. He's Ralph Ignatowski. And then when I called my dad, said, "Can I go to school in Japan?" My father said, "Yes." There was no like, "Japan, no, yes. So the way I was raised, people are people. I go to Japan and I fall in love with a Japanese woman and I'm hitchhiking around with a Japanese guy. And I didn't realize it at the time, but I just connected East and West, that people in Wisconsin are people and people in Japan are people. And
Hmm.
and we're just all one human family. And I
Hmm.
think that idea is still not in American minds. They think, I mean, we have bombed Korea and Vietnam, and we're wanting to go to war with China and fight in Venezuela. And well, we don't fight Canada. We don't bomb the king in London, those white guys.
Mm.
But there's something about the East and West, America and Asia. But anyway, I just united and had a good time. So one day, a guy knocks on our door. We're just a bunch of students studying, huddled around the gas heater. And this guy knocks on the door, and we called him the man with the golden boots. He walks in and he says, "Hey guys, I was a Notre Dame student in this dorm here in Tokyo 2 years ago. I know what your life's like." And we're like, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, I just came from the hippie trail in Asia. I just traveled from London all across Asia, India, Afghanistan, up, and now I just got into Tokyo. It's wild, man. You got to go out to the hippie trail." So I'm like, "Oh my God, a god just came in here. The hippie trail. What's this?" And then he says goodbye. He's with us for 15 minutes. The man with the golden boots, at night comes in. So I'm like, hippie trail. So I get out a map and there's this hippie trail. So I don't want to go back to school in the United States. I do return to the United States, but I'm unhappy and I just can't focus on my studies. So one day I took 4 envelopes, wrote to my 4 professors and said, "I'm hitting the road, Jack. Don't flunk me. I'll be back someday." And I hitchhiked to San Francisco, got a plane ticket, went back to Tokyo to tell my Japanese girlfriend, "I'm going to hitchhike across the hippie trail. I'm going around the world." I had made money, my own money, selling pots and pans that summer. I had $2,000 in my pocket, which was 1974, and you could go around the world. That was big money. So my Japanese girlfriend says, "Oh, I want to be an artist, and my parents want me to be a doctor. They're both doctors, and I'm going to commit suicide." You're going to commit suicide? So I'm a young kid and I'm like, "Oh, Japanese commit. Oh my God." She says, "You should take me. I'll travel with you." And I'm like, she's going to run away from home and travel with me? So I said, "Okay, let's meet tomorrow and talk about this." So I thought about it all night. And we met in a park, very formal Japanese. She's got her back straight. And I said, "Emmy, let me ask you one question. You take off with me, and what's that going to do to your life?" She said, "It's going to improve my life." I said, "Okay." So her parents were doctors, so she knew doctors' kids. And we broke into their medicine, whatever you call it, their pharmacies, and we got shots and they had the stamps to put stamp on your health passport. And then a week later at 3 a.m., I went to her garden at 3 a.m., a quiet Tokyo neighborhood, crickets, and I take a bamboo ladder that we had put in the garden and I put it up to her second-story bedroom window. And she had stuffed her bed with pillows and wrote a goodbye note to her parents. And she came down that ladder and she left home for 9 months. Her
That's
parents
romantic.
woke up the next day. "Emmy, come on, honey," and opened up the covers and there was pillows and a goodbye note. "Parents, I'm taking off with a gaijin, with a foreigner with hair on his knuckles, a barbarian," They must have been horrified, you know what I mean? But I was 20 years old and I wasn't thinking of parents' pains. I was just thinking about helping this girl that I was in love with. It was a real love affair. So we don't go to the airport because we're afraid the police will chase us. So we hitchhike down to a little Kagoshima airport. We take a puddle jumper to Taipei and we begin a trip around the world. We go Taipei, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Kathmandu, Nepal, go across India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran. We get sick and we have to live in Iran for 3 months. She gets hepatitis. She's in a hospital. I'm teaching English to the biggest chicken farmer in Iran. I'm typing notes for an English doctor in a hospital. I meet the Shah of Iran's wife. I'm meeting all these top flight people in Iran, having a great time. She gets better. We go to Turkey, Italy, Paris, London, and we say goodbye. The day of her flight to leave, we get up and, we're kind of sad. We're not talking. And then we're about to go out the door. And then silently we look at each other and hug each other, start crying, fall on the bed. And we held each other long enough that we couldn't get to the airport. So then we get up and my God, and back then you couldn't change a flight by phone. We had to go down to the airport, to the airport office, change the flight, okay, tomorrow, she will go. And next day we get up and take a shower and she's all packed and we're about to go out the door and we grab each other and we lie down. We had been together 9 months every single moment, traveling.
Yeah.
You travel across to Afghanistan on a bus and you get to know people. You know what I mean?
Do
I,
you
I
ever
won't
know
get.
how her parents reacted when she went back?
Oh, yeah. No, her parents, I have a letter in the next room. It's a letter from a lawyer in Washington, D.C. to my father. My poor dad's his innocent guy, opens up his mail, Antigo, Wisconsin. Dear Mr. Bradley, your son has kidnapped the daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Oshima from Tokyo, and we will not prosecute if he will let us know where the daughter is and he returns her to her home. They hired a lawyer like begging, where's our daughter? We won't put, my dad goes home, he says to his wife, Betty, James kidnapped a girl and they won't put him in jail if they just, they don't know where I am. This is 1975. Aerograms, there's no telephone
Right.
calls. We wanted to make a call from Iran to Tokyo when Emmy got sick. We had to go to a post office, book the call, and then 2 days later, somebody knocked on our door, said there's an open international line, and then you had to pick up the phone, and somebody had to connect fuzzy wires to Tokyo, and, it took 3 days to make an international call out of Iran. So my parents didn't know what country I was in. I was writing aerograms to them that would take a month to get back. I got sick in Afghanistan and almost died. I spent 3 days unconscious in the American Embassy dispensary. So there's a lot of stories. Anyway, we went around the world. So what I'm saying is, James Michener says, hey, have some adventures. And then I want to be a football player and I break my neck. I'm unhappy at Notre Dame, a football school, and a guy taps me on the shoulder, go to Japan. I go to Japan, a
Yeah.
guy taps me on the shoulder, go on the hippie trail. So, you really do become what you think about. And I wasn't consciously looking for this stuff, but this stuff just happens. So Emmy leaves, I'm alone in Europe, and then I'm broke. So I get a job selling pots and pans in Germany and Italy, and I get money back together. I was a good salesman, went to Wisconsin, back to the University of Wisconsin, got a degree in East Asian history. People say he got a degree in East Asian history and then he later wrote about Asia. No, I got a degree in East Asian history because that's where I had the credits and I was too dumb to do math or science and I could tell stories and I had to go to 3 universities to get a BA degree. So no professor ever saw me as some genius. After Wisconsin, I go to New York because there's a friend there with an apartment and I sleep on the floor and I answer want ads and I get a job in the entertainment business. We're producing entertainment for big corporations. And then all of a sudden, I'm working with Bob Hope and Tony Bennett and Ella Fitzgerald and Jay Leno and all these stars, and I'm not a big deal, but I was trained how to go to corporations and sell them entertainment for their banquets. And I'm working with all these stars and it was fascinating. And I started my own company. So now I'm a big deal. I've got 3 cars, 2 apartments. I'm dating Miss Hawaii and living the big New York life. But I'm unhappy because I'm not really a businessman. What I didn't realize is the business of business is business. You've got to be a bean counter and you've got to be interested in money. And I was a good storyteller. I was a good salesperson, but I wasn't a good manager. And my company, I didn't know how to manage people's complaints and budgets and all that. And I sold out to my partner in Tokyo. We had offices in New York and Tokyo. I had a partner in Tokyo, Yoshi. So I sell out
No.
for not a lot of money and I pack up all my possessions and I think, I'm 36 and, I'm not doing what I want to do and I want to figure out what to do. So the holiest place, not holy in terms of religion, but the most spiritually inspiring place I was ever in was Nepal. And I thought, I'm going to Nepal. And I got a notebook and I wrote, Kathmandu, I'll soon see you. And I went to Nepal and I got a kid to be my guide. And I said, take me up to Mount Everest. and we got 3 yaks. I went up to Mount Everest, and I said to myself, I'm not coming down till I figure out what to do. So if you go up to Mount Everest, there's no food up there, you know? There's no oxygen up there. There's no dogs, cats, fishes in the lake. There's no oxygen. Putting on your boots takes 20. So I'm up, crazy guy all alone up at Mount Everest, living in a tent with all my possessions. And there's one place to get food, which was this disgusting smoky hut. We called it the smoky hut. Some Nepalese had taken tin cans and wood and just put together this hut with holes in it, and there was a fire in the middle, a fire pit, and they would roast like, yak meat. I mean, you want to eat yak, and then tea. They would have tea and just
How did it taste
disgusting.
like? Yak meat?
Yak meat tastes like yak meat. I mean, yak milk, yak meat, man, you were really stinky, stinky. And they had tea and noodles. And so you had to go into the smoky hut, and it was freezing outside. So I'd go in there to get warm, have a cup of tea. So one day I'm in the smoky hut, and, I've got a headlamp on because it's dark and it's all smoky, and I look at the shelf and I see that there's cans up there, but they're all full of soot. Like you can see the shapes of cans, but they're like got gook on them. And I reach up, one of these disgusting cans, and then I take a cloth and I wipe it, and it's foie gras. It's French foie gras. And
Not
I take
bad.
another, what?
Not bad. That's a
It's
good
French.
score.
The French hiking team had taken foie gras up there, but these
Right.
Nepalese didn't know what it was and didn't like it. So then I take the next can, and it's like gourmet French. The French mountaineering team had spent thousands of dollars getting foie gras and all these French. There's a whole shelf of French food. And I'm like, you guys want this? And they said, no, it's disgusting. You can take it. So I go back and I get a bag, and I'm taking everything off the shelf. And then there's something stuck to the back of the wall, and I adjust my light, and I look, and it's a book, but it's a book slammed against the wall with all this soot and gook. And I pry the book off the wall, the cover's gone, and there's this oily book, and it's a book by Dick Francis. Who's Dick Francis? Dick Francis is a huge author. He was Queen Elizabeth's favorite author because he wrote horsey books about horse racing. And he had been a jockey, a very successful jockey who got thrown from a horse. He broke his leg, his career ended. Then he picked up the pen and he wrote all these bestsellers in England. So I knew who Dick Francis was because I had lived in London after New York. And I'm reading this book, and it's a little book by Dick Francis on how to be an author. And he said, I got hurt. I wasn't an author. I became an author. You can too. And he showed, he just told the story how you can become an author. So I'm like, I'm up at Mount Everest trying to figure out what to do. There's only one book up at Mount Everest, and it's a book about how to become an author. I guess maybe I'll be an author. So
That's like a sign
that
from
I
God.
yeah, but what I want to say to the listener, see, people want to dismiss the story. Oh, he got inspired and then he became an author. No, 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 no. For weeks, I walked around the slag heaps up at Mount Everest and watching the sunrise, sunset, and all the strange things up at Mount Everest, just imagining that I was an author because I had nothing else to do. See, after this interview, you have to go to your stove and make some tea and get in your car and do the. I had nothing to do. I was up at Mount Everest, didn't know anybody. Nobody wanted to talk to me. They're all on mountaineering teams. I mean, there were yaks, and I was in a survival mode. It took
Yeah.
forever just to, like, if you want to cook at Mount Everest, a flame this big in California is this big up at Mount Everest. There's no oxygen. So just surviving up there took a long time. So I just had nothing else to think about, and I imagined myself as an author. So then a few weeks later, I put the yaks together, go down, and I buy a notebook, cheap notebook in a mountain, highest town in the world, Namche Bazaar. And they had a notebook and a cheap pen. So I started writing. The point is, I stay in India and Africa, and I have no job. I have no friends. I have no contact with the real world. But the only thing I'm thinking about is, like, if I was an author, I'd have a book on the shelf, and then it would say James Bradley on the spine. And I had nothing else to do but think about this. And that's what my next book is about. that if you will spend 6 months or a year imagining and feeling yourself into a situation, you will get there. The only reason you're going to be able to do something tomorrow is because in advance you have imagined yourself in that situation. The only reason you're able to marry somebody or get a certain job or be a plumber or a professor or whatever is unconsciously in advance, you absorb the emotion and the thinking about it. Well, I accidentally, because I was isolated in India and Africa, had nothing else to think about other than being an author. Gee, if I wrote a book, how long would it be? Well, I don't like 500-page books. My books would be about 350 pages. Well, guess what? All the books I've written have been between 300 and 400 pages, but that came out of my head years ago. Okay, well, this is not some simple, happy story. I go back to New York and I have to face reality. I got to work, I got to make money. So
Yeah.
I go back into my old industry and I'm working in the entertainment business but I'm not happy. For the first time in my life, like to get to 5 p.m. was a big deal. I don't enjoy my days, but at night I continue to write and I'm writing unsuccessfully and I'm talking to people about writing and they're all laughing at me. And then my dad dies and he leaves these papers. And we had no idea that he had saved boxes of papers. Every president from Truman to Reagan wrote to my dad, "Would you come to the White House, Mr. Bradley?" John Wayne wrote to him asking for his autograph. He had boxes of stuff. And because I had imagined myself as an author, I looked at this stuff from an author's point of view. And I thought, this is the world's most famous photograph, most reproduced photograph. This is Iwo Jima, an unbelievable battle. It's got President Roosevelt, Truman in here, Eisenhower, Gloria Swanson, John Wayne. I mean, this is going to be a big book. So
Yeah.
I imagined what?
And before your dad died and you were writing at night in New York, can I ask what you were writing about?
Well, they said, Dick Francis said, write your autobiography because you know the material.
Yes.
So
So was that what you were writing?
I was writing my autobiography, but it didn't make sense. Like I hadn't gone to the moon. I
Yeah.
hadn't invented the polio vaccine. I mean, but the point is I kept doing it. What I didn't know when I look back, I was being trained in a boot camp how to write. I was being trained to be frustrated. I was being trained that this is not working. I got to rewrite it. I was being trained, this story should maybe just the endless torture of an author. Maybe I should take the story from chapter 3 and put it in chapter 2 and just all the boring details of an author. I was being trained in this frustration. So I'm in New York. I know the entertainment business, agents, and then my dad dies. And my dad gifts me these boxes. See, Jenny, if my dad had talked all his life about this stuff, I wouldn't have had a book. But I had all these secrets and I saw it as a book. So I
Yeah.
telephoned my mom. I said, Mom, I'm going to write a book about Dad, and it's going to be a New York Times #1 bestseller. I didn't think I could write a bestseller. It was that the photo was so huge. This
Right.
is the most reproduced photo in history. If you go to Kenya, to the capital, and you look at their national monument, it's 6 Africans raising the flag. Okay? It's the
Mm,
world's tallest bronze monument.
right.
This is the most reproduced. I've sat at the Marine Corps Memorial in Arlington, and buses of Chinese tourists get out, and then I follow them to the gift store, and they're all buying photos of the flag raising monument. I'm thinking, what are the Chinese? They're bringing back like poster quality photos of this thing to put on walls in China. So go anywhere in the world and show the Iwo Jima flag raising photo. They've made stamps of it, okay? 3 stamps.
Iconic.
It's
Yes.
iconic. So I thought, this is the #1 photo, and I'll write a book, and it'll be a #1 book. And I thought, what's a #1 book? Oh, that's a New York Times bestseller. So I thought, I'll just convince myself that this is true, and I'll convince others, and it'll become true. So I'm in this mental game. So I call my mother. Mom, I'm going to write a book. It's going to be a New York Times bestseller. My mother goes, well, yeah, maybe some people around the hometown will buy it. I'm skiing with my brother. We're going up the lift. Hey, Mark, 6 guys raised the flag. I'm the only one that's interviewed the families. I'm the only one that has the stories. It's going to be a New York Times #1 bestseller. We get to the top. Mark adjusts his goggles, looks at the mountain, looks at me and says, yeah, well, I don't see it. Boom, So that was the support from the family. So I go out to the publishing industry. Here's the #1 photo in history. And I'm going to write a book. I'm a son of one of the guys. I've got the interviews. Nobody else has the stories. So I'm a marketing guy. What I'm trying to say is, this is the #1 photo, and it's not a photo of cows or haystacks or mountains. It's a photo of humans, and nobody has the human story other than me. Yeah, that
Right.
photo, Flags of Our Fathers. So I'm saying nobody else has the story but me. So I'm going to put the story in a book, and it's going to be #1. I mean, don't you get it? And
Yeah, I get it.
I'm saying to the publisher, don't you get it? And
Right.
they're like, nah, you're not an author, blah, blah, blah. So I'm shocked that anybody turns me down. Then 2 turn me down. I'm like, this is not possible. The 3rd one will say yes. The 3rd one turns me down. The 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th. My wife is crying face down on the bed. I have my friend Peter comes in from Chicago. Hey, Pete, how you doing? He invites me to lunch. I thought he came in to be friendly. He came in to do an intervention. James, 18 publishers have said no. Don't you think the publishers know the book business better than you, James? James, you got to give it up. It's not going to be a book, James. So my family, friends, everybody, and they were right in a way. Just think, your neighbor says, I've been pitching this for 2 years and I got 24 turn downs. So, of course, you're like, this failure over here sitting in his room writing this stupid book. I mean, 24. So eventually 27 publishers turned me down. And then the 28th gave us a little okay, and the book came out, and boop, is automatic New York Times #1. Went worldwide. Steven Spielberg bought it, but it wasn't because of me. It was because of me as a marketing guy, but it wasn't because of me as an author. Yes, I wrote the book, but it was because of the photo. People know the photo. So that book goes out. It's New York Times #1. Steven Spielberg buys the movie, and I want to write another book. So my second book is Flyboys, but before it was Flyboys, this guy had called me about a secret war crimes trial that took place in Guam after World War II. So it's a secret war crimes trial. It's about how on the island of Chichijima, Japanese soldiers had captured 8 American aviators and cut off their heads and cut open their stomachs and barbecued their livers. So it's this horrible war crimes trial about these guys, these cannibal Japanese, eating these aviators. And if you'll excuse me for 1 second, I got to go off camera and just move this thing before down. Okay. Now we're okay. But 8 guys get their heads cut off, but a 9th guy got away, and his name was George Herbert Walker Bush. So President Bush, former head of the CIA, was shot down, and the Japanese were after him, but an American submarine picked him up. But if they hadn't picked him up, he would have been had his head cut off, but nobody knew the whole story because it was a secret war crimes trial. So this is George Bush is in Yale after World War II. Are you with me? He has a little kid named George Jr. and
Yes, I
he
know.
doesn't know about this war crimes trial.
So
So
when
I
the
get
first
all
time you heard about this, right? What was your reaction?
okay. The great Iris Chang, who wrote The Rape of Nanking,
Mhm.
she and I became friends. I did Flags of Our Fathers. She did Rape of Nanking. We spoke on the same stages. I knew her. We talked on the phone all the time. And she's the one who said, James, there's this crazy guy in Iowa who has this story about cannibalism. And she said, it's just too crazy for me. She said, why don't you call him? So I call the guy up. Well, Iris Chang had turned him down. The BBC had turned him down. And I thought maybe the guy's crazy. But if Steven Spielberg finds this guy, maybe it's true. So the next day I fly out to Iowa, and I'm out with this guy at his kitchen table, and he's telling me the story that he witnessed this trial, but he's old and dying, and now he can swore to secrecy, but now he wants the story of these guys. See, 8 guys got their heads cut off, and the mothers
Yeah.
were never told what happened. The families never knew what happened. So I got this information. I called up the families. Hey, Henry, you know your brother George? Yeah. How did he die? He crashed into the Pacific and died on impact. I said, okay, George, he didn't. He survived that crash. He got onto the island. He learned Japanese. He spent 3 months with the Japanese going to sake parties. And then one day they told him to kneel down. They cut his head off. So the families didn't know what happened to their, I had to inform all the families. I told one of the girlfriends what happened to her boyfriend, that he got his head cut off. She later told me, Mr. Bradley, I hated you. I went into shock for 6 months. And then later she loves me because I told the truth. But so this was a big, big story.
Right.
George Bush, is like, what do you, he said, I read Flags of Our Fathers, James, but what are you talking about? So finally I get into George Bush and I tell Bush the story, and he says, take me back to Chichijima where he got shot down. And we brought Paula Zahn and CNN. We shot a 1-hour documentary. And that's this book, Flags of Our Fathers, about this secret island right next to Iwo Jima. So Iwo Jima, they're raising a flag. And the last guy in the flag raising is Ira Hayes, an Indian. That day they raised the flag, an Indian from Texas, Warren Earl Vaughn, got shot down on the next island, and he got his head cut off. Ira Hayes is famous. Warren Earl Vaughn, nobody knew who he was because the government shushed it up. And I had to go through hell to get the government to release the data on this. I went to the wall. So that's Flyboys. And Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks bought Flyboys to put in their series, the HBO series, The Pacific. So then I've written 2 books about World War II. And I'm thinking, how did this happen? Like, my dad's from Wisconsin and he's out on Iwo Jima. Like, why wasn't my dad out, in Chile? Like, why was America fighting in Asia in World War II? Like, how did that happen? That couldn't have, the story is, well, Pearl Harbor and that. No, I thought, must be something else. So I go back and I read, 200-300 books. And I realize Teddy Roosevelt pushed America out in the Pacific with the Spanish-American War. That our first Vietnam was not Vietnam. Our first Vietnam was the war in the Philippines. We were massacring and torturing and raping out in the Philippines. And that was our first quagmire. Teddy Roosevelt was a failure, just like See, Teddy Roosevelt was a vice president who became vice president because the president died. Well, Lyndon Johnson was a vice president, became president. They both inherited a war. And they both had this quagmire that was very unpopular. There were hearings about waterboarding torture in the Philippines, and Teddy was covering it up. And Teddy was covering up torture in the Philippines like Lyndon Johnson was covering up torture in Vietnam. But it was Teddy Roosevelt. There's the Imperial Cruise. So the Imperial Cruise is about Theodore Roosevelt pushing America out. And the idea is basically this. Britain is making a fortune in China, in Asia, because they've got Hong Kong, Shanghai. The French have Vietnam. The British have Singapore. Well, America wanted into the game, so they got the Philippines. And then by having the Philippines, we're going to get rich in Asia. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was an idiot. He never saw the Pacific, didn't know anything about Asia. He had racial theories. And Teddy Roosevelt's idea was that the Japanese were more racially like us Aryans, us Aryan Americans.
I think you said Yankees of the East in your book.
They were the Yankees of the West. The Japanese, see, it's a long history, but America and Britain came out to Asia, and the Chinese were like, they reacted like, what's happening? But the Japanese said, we're small. We better glom on to the Americans and say that we're allies, or else they're going to eat us. So the Japanese put on suits and ties and sent their kids to Harvard. And yeah, we're just like a little America. And they became the Yankees of the Far East. So Teddy Roosevelt had the Monroe Doctrine for Asia, the Japanese Monroe Doctrine for Asia, and read about it. Wikipedia won't let this up. Wikipedia has gotten this off. They scraped it off. You can't see the truth. But in the Imperial Cruise, you'll see Teddy Roosevelt says to Japan, it's natural that you take Korea. Japan is here and Korea's here and China's here. And you can take Korea. You should
That was a
civilize
Nobel
Korea.
Peace Prize.
And then, yeah, but nobody asked Teddy Roosevelt, what if Japan goes to Korea and then Korea's connected to China? What if they go to China? Ho, ho, ho. No, I'm Teddy Roosevelt. We're going to control those little Japanese and they'll always listen to the Americans. So Japan goes into China. And that is a result of Theodore Roosevelt greenlighting Japan into Korea. So that
And
is the begin. Go ahead.
yes, I want to go back to that because that was the part that I was very drawn into. And you had mentioned in your book that Teddy Roosevelt brought this guy called Baron Conical. And he was talking about the bear of Asia and killing the bear and hunting. And then eventually Conical and him became pen pals.
So it's Kanoko or Kanako, I don't know how to pronounce it. But Baron Kanoko, Emperor Meiji is like, we're fighting Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. We can't beat them. We're going to have to negotiate. Well, who's going to negotiate for us? Baron Kanoko, you went to Harvard with Teddy Roosevelt, right? Baron Kanoko, you speak English, you dress in nice,
Suit.
suits. You go to America and you get in Teddy Roosevelt's life and you persuade him that Japan will always listen to America and Teddy should make a deal against the Russians for the Chinese or for the Japanese because we know Teddy hates those Russians. So this is true. Baron Kanoko gets into the White House and Teddy Roosevelt knows nothing about Asians. We've got the Chinese Exclusion Act. Asians aren't allowed in the country. Nobody wants to live
Yes.
next to a Chinese. If Teddy Roosevelt's son had wanted to marry a Chinese, I mean, oh my God, a scandal. But a Japanese, I went to Harvard and I speak Boston English. And Teddy, we're friends. And the Japanese are just like the Americans. And he completely bamboozles the great Theodore Roosevelt. Americans don't like to know this. Look at the evidence. Teddy's writing, thank you so much for coming and informing me about Asia. And yes, Japanese and Japanese will always be the friends of America and Japan will, and then, Baron Kanoko, yes, we will always listen to you, President, and dot, 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 dot. So
And
Theodore,
then decades later, the Japanese then tortured the guy, the picture behind you. And so it's not and so this whole story is kind of circular. So I think it's so interesting when I'm reading your book and then I'm always thinking that wow, these stories are so interconnected.
well, there's a reason we were out in Asia. Theodore Roosevelt said to Japan, you can go into Korea, but you'll stop before China, right? And Japan said yes. Well, Japan takes over Korea, tortures Korea, and then what do you want to do? Expand the empire. So they go from Korea into China. Now, my next book is called The China Mirage, and there's a lot of stories in here, but once again, it's about fooling a Roosevelt. The richest family in China, basically the Rothschilds of China, the Astors of China, the Song family. They've got 3 daughters and a son, and they are all schooled in America, some at Harvard. They speak perfect English. They're the richest people. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's grandfather, the guy who gave Franklin Roosevelt all the money that he lived on all his life, was Warren Delano. Well, how did Warren Delano make his money? He was the
Opium.
American opium king of China. So the money that supported Princeton University, Harvard, Columbia, the first railroads in America, the first big hospitals, that all came from drug dealing.
Hmm.
These were drug dealers, the Astors, John Forbes Carey. Well, his great-great-grandfather was an opium dealer in China. The Delanos, that was opium money. So Roosevelt thinks he's an expert on China because Grandpa was a drug dealer in China. And then the richest family in China, the Song family, comes over and they said, hey, we got this dictator, Chiang Kai-shek, and we married one of our daughters, we married her in. And Chiang Kai-shek, he wants to be a Christian just like you. Yeah, no, 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 no. We love America. Yeah, 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 yeah. Support China. So Franklin Roosevelt has got, again, just like Teddy, has got this inner White House. He told his people, you leave China to me. I have an understanding of China. So both the Roosevelts had never been out to Asia. They had no Asian friends. They didn't know anything about Asia. But Teddy got fooled by the Japanese, and Franklin got fooled by the Chinese. It was just personal diplomacy by very wealthy people. So Franklin Roosevelt is supporting this horrible dictator, Chiang Kai-shek. See, Mao Zedong came to power because of the Chinese people's support. Americans say China fell to communism in 1940. They didn't fall to communism. Mao was a popular leader. They supported Mao against the horrible dictator, Chiang Kai-shek. America supported the dictator, Chiang Kai-shek. But when Japan invaded the coast of China, Chiang Kai-shek moved to the middle. So we kind of supported Chiang Kai-shek, but Wall Street was making big money on Japan. Wow. Goodyear Rubber, U.S. Steel, J.P. Morgan Bank. Wow. Japan was building railroads, hotels, infrastructure. Wow. We're making money. So the Japanese incursion into China, that was all supported by Franklin Roosevelt. So there's a lot of history here. And then things go topsy-turvy. There's Pearl Harbor. We fight Japan. And then we think, well, now we're going to rule China through Chiang Kai-shek, now that we've put the Japanese in their box, and we fight the Chinese Civil War. Jenny, there would have been no Chinese Civil War if America hadn't supported the wrong side. It
And
was
it's so
just like,
interesting too. In your book, you mentioned that Chiang Kai-shek was mentioned on the Times Magazine 8 times for being the democracy leader of China, but in reality, he was a dictator.
just like Zelensky.
Yes,
Zelensky of Ukraine is Times Man of the Year. He's a horrible Nazi stealing money. Well,
asking.
Chiang Kai-shek was on Time magazine more than any other human, more than Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, General MacArthur, because the owner of Time, Henry Luce, his father was a missionary in China, and they
Mm.
wanted to get Christianity. And the Song family said, if you support our dictator, we will get Christianity
And
into.
Song family actually made money from selling Bibles in China.
They sold that's why it's the China Mirage. The Song family sold the concept to America. People were not going to believe this almost. Right after Pearl Harbor, there was a poll. Who's our number one friend in the world? And it was China. It wasn't the UK. It wasn't France. China was the number one. China wants to be just like us. That's why so we didn't know anything about Mao because Time magazine and Pearl Buck writes this book about the Chinese are just like Americans. Well, her father was a missionary. Pearl Buck grew up in China. This was all this Christian missionary thing. Okay. So that's the China Mirage. My point is, I wrote Flags of Our Fathers and Flyboys about World War II. Then I wanted to figure out how we got to Asia. And the Imperial Cruise tells the story of Teddy Roosevelt getting us out there. And then the China Mirage tells how Franklin Roosevelt stumbled us into World War II out in Asia. It's not the history that's, presented, but it's all documented. Okay. So now I'm done with World War II. And I think, my brother went to fight in Vietnam when I was 13. He was 18. And what happened out there in Vietnam? I didn't really know. So I started reading some books. And the American narrative about the Vietnam War is we could have won if only. Just ask a Green Beret. What happened in Vietnam? Oh, we could have genocided them, but we didn't fight hard enough. Ask somebody else what happened in Vietnam. We could have won, but the press gave up and the hippies protested and, Congress cut the funding or else we would have, I've asked generals, what happened in Vietnam? Well, we were winning. So I go to Vietnam and I'm thinking, I'll go to Vietnam for 3 years and write a book. Jenny, I was in and out of Vietnam for 5 years and then I moved there for 10 years. I spent 10 years living in Vietnam interviewing the Vietnamese. If you go to Vietnam, they tell the truth, which is completely different than the American narrative. If you look at Ken Burns, Walter Cronkite, pick up a documentary or a book written by an American, and it's baloney. It's the American side. We didn't really lose. We could have won. Well, I caddied for Vince Lombardi of the Green Bay Packers, and it was black and white. You won or lost. So I go to Vietnam. We lost. So this is the shocking thing about this latest book, Precious Freedom. I'm the only American author who, in 50 years, ever went to Vietnam and said, "How did you guys win? You obviously won. How did you do it?" Nobody else asked the question. And I trace this back to my going to school in Japan, that I was influenced by James Michener, who wrote about the Asians, and he married a Japanese woman. Then I go to Japan and I'm like, the Japanese are humans. I research in Asia, and to me, it's one human family. So I'm the
Yeah.
first. The Americans won't give credit. Oh, the Vietnamese, they had those jungles and they accidentally won. And no, they didn't. They had a plan better than us. But I think with America, if you put a picture of John Kennedy here, cufflinks, tie, handsome, you put a picture of Ho Chi Minh here, sandals, wrinkled cotton shirt, scraggly beard. It doesn't make sense to an American that Ho Chi Minh was smarter than John Kennedy. If you look at Robert McNamara, he was a genius, Harvard, his hair back. And then Ho Chi Minh, is chopsticks and no, Ho Chi Minh studied the West for 30
Inferior.
years.
He looks inferior. He has an inferior look.
But I think still today, Americans look at a big muscled Marine and they look at a skinny little Vietnamese and like they couldn't have won. The Vietnamese had no jets. They had no aircraft carriers. That there's a mystery. We really should have won. So anyway, I went to Vietnam and I'm the only one who respected the Vietnamese enough to say, "How did you win?" I wrote down what they said. And it's this remarkable book, Precious Freedom, that veterans are very excited to read this. I'm getting a lot of email because it's like, "Mr. Bradley, how could we go 50 years without knowing this?" Then I'll tell one last story here, and then you can ask me anything you want. But I said that I read James Michener when I was a little boy. Well, after I wrote Flags of Our Fathers, publishers would not listen to my next book, Flyboys, because they thought I was a one-hit wonder. That's what they called me. So the publisher who did Flags of Our Fathers, he had the #1 book in the country. And he said to my agent, "Well, we're not interested in his next one because he's a one-hit wonder." So I have to go out and restart my career. And I'm knocking on doors of agents. And I knock on the door of the #1 agent in the world. His name was Owen Laster. And Owen Laster sees Flyboys, takes me on, and really creates my career. Well, guess what? Owen Laster was the agent for James Michener. So the guy who really created my career was James Michener's agent. Owen Laster took me to the William Morris Agency book of authors. It's a huge old book, parchment old, and they have authors signing that book from 1898. And
Wow.
James Michener's signature is in the book. And then Owen turned to a new page and he said, "James, here's the pen." And I signed the author register with James Michener's name in there. So that's basically my life story. There's some other stories, and I know I left a lot out. If I've confused anything, Jenny, just ask me whatever you want.
That's a sign from God with that agent story in the end. Have you ever heard from that girl who went 9 months with you? Her parents were doctors. Did she ever become doctors?
So Emmy Oshima, I said, "Emmy, if you take off with me, what's that mean?" She said, "It'll help my life." So we go around the world. She goes back to Japan. Her parents don't talk to her for 2 months, but they free her from the iron cage of being a doctor, and she goes on to become a children's author. So it did change her life. Now listen to this. I get married and she gets married and we lose contact. George Bush, after I tell him the secrets I have, says, "James, take me back to Japan, to Chichijima." And he says to the Secret Service, Bradley's taken us to Japan. Just let's do what Bradley says. So now I'm in charge of arranging for the president to go to Japan. So I need a great interpreter. Well, I went to school in Japan. I had an office in Japan. I knew some interpreters, but like I need someone like really sensitive. I'm with the president. The next day I get an email. It's from Emi Oshima. Hadn't seen her name in 25 years. Hi, James. How you doing? I saw your book at a book fair and I just thought I'd say hello. I'm like, oh my God. Hey, Emmy, would you like to be the interpreter for George? So the next time I saw Emmy Oshima is when she got on the plane with George Bush and me
Wow.
outside of Tokyo to fly to Iwo Jima. And she was the interpreter for this whole process.
Wow. That's an interesting story, actually. Yeah, I think that's all my questions. I am very
Okay.
happy. Yeah, and I'm really looking for more. So you're going to be on our podcast as a recurring guest, right?
Well, we can go through all these historical stories now that folks know a little about me. They can tune in or tune out, but I'm very happy to be on your podcast.
Thank you so much, James. And we'll see you guys next time. And please subscribe.